I worked day and night to provide for our family, while my wife Julia seemed like the perfect partner. But one day, a random message changed everything. Is she really cheating on me? Her innocent demeanor and the conversations I started overhearing ignited suspicions deep inside me. What if it's more than just an affair? A meeting with her mysterious acquaintance, a safe she desperately tried to hide, and a video that could destroy all our lives. But who is she truly protecting? Herself or me? Am I ready to uncover the full truth about Julia, who has become an enigma to me? Stay tuned to hear the shocking conclusion to this story. While I worked overtime, my wife cheated. My revenge became legendary. Mark sat in his small office cubicle, staring at his computer screen. His eyes ached from the endless hours of work, but he knew he couldn't stop. Lately, he had been working overtime because management had promised him a promotion. His wife, Julia, always said she dreamed of a carefree life, and Mark was willing to do anything to provide that for her. Every day looked the same. Work, a quick coffee break, then more work. Late returns home had become the norm. Julia always greeted him with a warm dinner and a gentle kiss, but Mark began to notice that something had changed. Her gaze had become distant, their conversations short, and she kept her phone close, even in the bathroom. One day, coming home early due to a sudden meeting cancellation, Mark noticed an unusual silence in the house. Julia was always home at that time, but she wasn't there. On the kitchen table was a cup of half-finished coffee and a note. Went out to meet a friend. Don't wait up. Love you. Mark decided not to pay much attention, but the next morning, he found a man's shirt in the washing machine that didn't belong to him. His heart sank. Maybe it's just something random, he thought, but doubts had already taken root in his mind. A few days later, coming home late one evening, he overheard a conversation from another room. Julia was speaking softly, but Mark caught snippets. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Everything's going according to plan. She abruptly went silent when she noticed his presence. Who were you talking to? Mark asked, trying to sound calm. Oh, just Susan. We were planning our next spa day. Why do you ask? She replied with a slightly nervous smile. Mark nodded, but his suspicions lingered. Over the next few days, he began to watch Julia more closely. Her behavior became increasingly enigmatic. She left the house without explanation, spent a lot of time on her phone, and often seemed absent even when she was physically present. One evening, when Julia said she was going to the gym, Mark decided to verify her words. Quietly, he took his car and followed her. He was shocked when he saw her stop at an upscale restaurant and go inside. A few minutes later, a tall man in a stylish suit joined her. They sat at a table in the corner and seemed far too close. Mark felt his blood run cold. He took photos of them on his phone and drove home. He spent the evening pondering his next move. His world was beginning to crumble. When Julia came home, she looked tired but happy. Mark sat in the living room with a cold stare but said nothing. Mark sat in the dark of his bedroom, looking at the photos he had taken that night. The images of Julia laughing with the unknown man were blurry but damning enough. His heart ached with pain and anger. Why was she doing this? What had gone wrong in their marriage? He made a decision. No more doubts. He needed undeniable proof. The next day, Mark called a technician to install hidden cameras in the house. He knew it was an extreme step, but he saw no other way. Cameras were set up in the living room, kitchen, and even their bedroom. Conflicting emotions tore at him. Was he ready to see the truth? Meanwhile, Julia acted as if nothing had happened. She was gentle and cheerful, even offering to make his favorite meal for dinner. But this only made Mark more suspicious. Her warmth felt artificial, like a mask she wore to play the role of the perfect wife. It wasn't long before the cameras captured something unusual. One evening, when Mark was working late, Julia came home, but she wasn't alone. He watched the footage with bated breath. The same man from the restaurant entered the house. They sat on the couch, and their conversation quickly turned into an embrace. Are you sure he doesn't know anything? The man asked, glancing around. He's completely absorbed in his work, Julia replied, smiling. I've got everything under control. Mark felt his blood boil. He stopped the recording and began pacing the room nervously. He was filled with rage, but knew he needed a clear head. He decided not to act immediately, but to wait for even more convincing evidence. In the following days, Mark noticed Julia spending more time outside the house. She claimed she was meeting friends, but Mark decided to verify her words. He hired a private investigator to follow her. A week later, the investigator brought back the first results. Julia was regularly meeting the same man, spending time at hotels, restaurants, and even taking trips out of town together. But the worst was yet to come. The investigator also discovered that the man was her ex-boyfriend, Justin, whom she had broken up with years ago. Mark had never known they had kept in touch. "She's been playing you all this time," the investigator said, handing Mark the photos. "But it seems she has another secret." Mark looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Julia has been visiting a lawyer. It seems she's preparing for a divorce." The detective's words struck like a bolt of lightning. Mark couldn't believe it. She wasn't just cheating on him. She was planning to leave him. That night, he watched Julia sleep, feeling rage boil inside him. His thoughts grew darker by the minute. If she wanted to play games, he would play too. But the rules would be his. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the story with Justin ran deeper than just an affair with Julia. The details he uncovered about the man's past were too alarming to ignore. Justin had a long history of schemes, multiple lawsuits that mysteriously appeared and disappeared, and ties to shady businesses. Everything pointed to him being far from who he pretended to be. Mark sat in his office, poring over the documents provided by the detective. Each new page stoked his anger and fear. If Justin was truly using Julia, she might not just be a victim. She could be complicit in his crimes. But what if she had no idea about his real intentions? Determined to act, Mark reached out to an old friend, Eric, who worked in cybersecurity. They met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, where Mark laid out the whole story. "This is really risky, Mark," Eric said, flipping through the documents. "If this Justin guy is as bad as you say, he could be dangerous. But we can try to dig something up." Eric promised to investigate Justin's bank accounts, connections, and movements. Meanwhile, Mark continued to play the role of an unsuspecting husband, though inside he was seething with anger. One evening, returning home, Mark saw Julia pacing the room nervously with her phone in hand. She didn't notice him enter and spoke into the phone. "We need to move faster. I can't wait any longer. He'll start to suspect something." Mark froze, trying to process her words. When Julia finally ended the call and noticed him, she looked visibly startled. "Oh, you're home already? I was just talking to Mom. She wants to visit." Mark smiled, but inside he was boiling. He didn't respond and went straight to the bedroom, where he turned on his laptop and began reviewing the camera footage. He watched Julia typing something on her laptop, then closing it, placing it in her bag, and leaving the house. The next day, Eric called Mark. "We've got a problem. Justin has accounts registered under fake names and significant transactions moving through offshore accounts. But here's the kicker. One of his companies transferred money to an account registered under your wife's name." Mark felt his knees buckle. Julia wasn't just a victim. She was part of this. He couldn't believe the woman he loved, for whom he worked tirelessly, could betray him like this. That night, Mark decided to take action. He installed tracking software on Julia's laptop to access her emails and files. His hands trembled as he uncovered the first emails. They were all from Justin. They discussed the details of their schemes, plans, and even how they would divide the money after Mark and Julia's divorce. But one email stood out from the others. In it, Julia wrote to Justin, "I can't do this anymore. It's too dangerous. Mark doesn't know, but if he finds out, we'll both end up in jail." For Mark, this was the point of no return. He realized Julia wasn't being forced. She was a willing participant in the fraud. The next morning, he met with Eric and laid out all the information he had gathered. "We need to go to the police," Eric said. "But you need to understand this could destroy not just her but you as well." Mark nodded, knowing there was no turning back. He agreed with Eric and decided to confront Julia to force her to confess the truth. That night, when Julia came home, Mark sat in the living room with documents and recordings spread out on the table. She froze in place when she saw his cold stare. "We need to talk," he said. "And don't even try to lie." Mark sat at the table in the living room, his gaze fixed on Julia. In front of him lay photos, letters, and printed emails. She stood near the door, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. "What's this, Mark?" she asked, pointing at the documents spread before him. Her voice was nervous, but she tried to maintain her composure. "This is your truth, Julia," he replied, his voice cold as ice. "And I want to hear everything. No lies." Julia sank into the chair opposite him, avoiding his gaze. "It's not what you think," she began, but Mark cut her off. "Then explain. The money in your account, these meetings with Justin. You call this not what I think?" She trembled, swallowing back tears. "Mark, I didn't want this. Justin, he forced me. He said that if I didn't help him, then—" Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "He threatened me. He threatened you." Mark leaned forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "And you decided to betray me? To help a con artist? How long have you been lying to me?" Julia raised her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Mark. You don't understand what he's capable of. He's done this to other people. I thought I could control the situation, that I could protect us." "Protect us?" Mark laughed bitterly. "You only protected yourself. And you don't even realize that I already know everything." He threw a printed email in front of her. "I can't do this anymore. Mark doesn't know, but if he finds out, we'll both end up in jail." "What is this, Julia?" She looked at the paper, her face turning pale. "It's taken out of context. I was trying." "Trying what?" Mark raised his voice. "To cover up your crimes? To save our family by destroying it?" Julia trembled. She knew there was no point in lying anymore. "Yes, I made a mistake," she said quietly, "but I did it for us. Justin, he manipulated me, Mark. I didn't want to, but I didn't know how to get out." Mark stayed silent, his gaze fixed on her, but she could no longer see love in his eyes. Only ice. "I loved you," she whispered, "and I still love you." "Love?" Mark stood abruptly. "You call this love? You don't get it, Julia. You've destroyed everything." Suddenly, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Justin's name. Mark noticed it. "Answer it," he ordered. She picked up the phone but didn't have a chance to say anything before Mark grabbed it from her hands and put it on speaker. "Julia," Justin's voice rang out. "Everything's ready. We need to finish this tonight." Mark stared at her, saying nothing. She lowered her head, knowing she had lost her last chance. Mark stood by the window, holding the phone in his hand. His fingers nervously gripped the device as dozens of scenarios swirled in his mind. He had just arranged a meeting with Justin. The location was unexpected, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Though it seemed like a trap, Mark felt he couldn't wait any longer. He needed the truth. Julia watched him from the corner of the room. Her eyes were red from crying, but she didn't dare say a word. Mark no longer trusted her, and she knew it. "I'm going alone," he said coldly, not even looking in her direction. "And if you want to even slightly redeem yourself, stay here and don't interfere." Julia tried to approach him, but he stepped back. "Don't." His voice was sharp. "You've done enough." Mark left the house, leaving her in silent despair. Outside, it was dark, and the air was heavy with the smell of rain. He got into his car and drove to the designated location. His heart pounded in his chest, and every minute of the drive felt like an eternity. When he arrived at the warehouse, silence greeted him. The place was lit by only a few lamps, casting ominous shadows on the walls. Mark turned off the engine, grabbed a hidden recorder, and stepped out of the car. "You came," a voice called from the darkness. Justin emerged from behind the metal doors, his silhouette outlined in the lamplight. He was dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in such a setting. "I want answers," Mark began, keeping his voice steady. "What are you planning? Why did you drag Julia into this?" Justin smiled, his grin sinister. "Oh, Mark, you're so naive. Your wife made her own choices. She wanted money. She wanted excitement. I just gave her the opportunity." "You're lying," Mark shouted, stepping forward. "She said you forced her." "Forced her?" Justin laughed. She enjoyed it, Mark. She was my partner long before you started suspecting anything. Mark felt rage boiling inside him. He wanted to hit Justin but held himself back. He needed the truth, not more lies. If that's true, prove it, Mark said, staring directly into Justin's eyes. Justin pulled a phone out of his pocket and showed him several video recordings. They featured Julia calmly discussing the details of their schemes with him, a genuine smile on her face. Mark felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. Do you understand now? Justin asked. She's not who you think she is. But Mark didn't give up. He pulled out his recorder and pressed record. If you're so sure of yourself, say it again, he demanded. Justin smirked, but there was a glint of unease in his eyes. You think you can expose me? He asked, stepping closer. You don't know who you're dealing with. Suddenly, the warehouse door creaked open, and two men dressed in black stepped inside. Mark realized he had walked into a trap. You shouldn't have come here, Justin said. But now that you're here, we can settle this once and for all. Mark tried to back away, but one of the men grabbed his arm. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around his wrists. You'll pay for your curiosity, Justin said, leaning in closer. And your wife, she will too. Mark's heart pounded as one of the men tightened his grip. Justin approached him again, his smile turning into a sinister look of triumph. You thought you could outsmart me? He said calmly. I warned you, Mark. Curiosity always comes at a price. Mark mustered all his strength, trying to come up with a plan. But the silence was shattered by the sound of a car engine. A vehicle skidded to a stop outside the warehouse, and the doors swung open. Julia? Mark whispered, seeing her silhouette illuminated by the headlights. She stepped out of the car, her face tense. She held her phone in her hand, hesitating before taking a step toward the warehouse. What are you doing here? Mark shouted, struggling to free himself. Justin slowly turned, his face a mix of surprise and irritation. I told you to stay home, Mark said to Julia, but she only shook her head. I couldn't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know this is all my fault, but I couldn't let you face this alone. Justin began clapping, his laughter echoing through the empty warehouse. What a dramatic twist. The wife decides to play hero? This is hilarious. Stay away from him, Julia said sharply, her voice steadier now. This is between us, Justin. Both Mark and Justin looked at her in surprise. Between us? Mark asked, confused. What does she mean? Julia took a step forward, her gaze fixed firmly on Justin. You wanted to use me, she said, her voice filled with anger. But I realized you're just a manipulator. I made a mistake trusting you, but you won't control me anymore. Justin tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Oh, really? And what are you going to do? Call the police? Let's see who gets hurt more, you or me. I already called the police, she replied coldly. They'll be here in a few minutes. Mark froze at her words. His mind raced. Was this Julia's plan all along? Or was she genuinely trying to fix things? He no longer knew whom to trust. Justin suddenly grabbed Julia's arm and pulled her closer to him. You're playing with fire, he hissed in her ear. If the police find out everything you've done, they'll lock you up just like me. I'm ready for that, she said, staring directly into his eyes. Are you? The sound of sirens pierced the night. The men in black began to panic, and Justin let go of Julia, stepping back. This isn't over, he said, glaring at Mark. You'll regret coming between us. The police stormed into the warehouse, capturing Justin and his accomplices. Mark and Julia stood aside, watching everything unfold. She tried to touch his hand, but he stepped back. We need to talk, she said quietly. Yes, we do, Mark replied, but his voice was empty. He no longer knew if he could ever trust her again. Mark sat at the kitchen table, taking deep breaths. The night after the warehouse incident had been sleepless. He couldn't stop thinking about Justin, the police, and Julia. Her words, her actions, all of it left more questions than answers. Julia walked into the kitchen, her steps cautious. She looked exhausted, but her gaze was determined. We need to talk, she said softly. Mark looked up at her but didn't reply. She sat across from him, placing her hands on the table and nervously twisting her fingers. "There's something else you need to know," she began. "It's hard to explain, but if I don't tell you, you'll never understand." Mark frowned. "What else have you been hiding, Julia? I thought there was nothing left." She looked at him, and in her eyes was something new, a mix of fear and despair. "It's about our marriage," she said. "And your company." Mark tensed. "My company? What about it?" Julia took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "Do you remember that first big contract that changed everything? When you started working with major clients?" Mark nodded. "Yes, and what about it? That was my breakthrough." I arranged it," she said, her voice faltering. "Or rather, Justin arranged it. He knew you were promising and convinced me to help you land that contract. He was already involved in his schemes back then, and that contract was part of his plan." Mark felt his chest tighten. "What are you?" He trailed off, not knowing how to continue. "Are you saying my entire career started because of Justin? Because of fraud?" Julia lowered her head. "I didn't know it was fraud at the time. He said it was just a favor. He convinced me that you deserved this chance." "Deserved?" Mark stood abruptly. "It was fraud, Julia. You let him use me, my business, everything I worked for. How could you?" "I didn't know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "But over time, I realized it was part of his plan. He wanted you to succeed because he knew he could manipulate you through me." Mark began pacing the room, trying to process what he had just heard. His entire life, his achievements, all of it was tainted by lies. "And now what?" he asked sharply. "What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Understanding? After all of this?" Julia stood and took a step toward him. "I want you to know the truth. I can't live with this anymore. And if you decide to leave, I'll understand. But I don't want to be a part of this anymore." She handed him a folder. "Everything you need to know is in here. All the deals, the documents that prove Justin used both of us. And if you want, you can expose him." Mark took the folder but didn't open it. He looked at Julia, trying to determine if he could trust her again. "If this is another game," he started, but she interrupted him. "No, Mark. I want you to know everything, even if it means you'll leave me." He said nothing. Her words sounded sincere, but his heart was in pieces. Mark sat in his office, staring at the folder Julia had given him. He was afraid to open it. What if what he found inside was yet another blow to his already shattered trust? But at the same time, he knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Slowly, he opened the folder. Inside were documents, contracts, bank statements, transactions. At first glance, it all looked like standard business paperwork. But then his eyes fell on a letter signed by Justin. It detailed the use of Mark's company for transferring funds disguised as legitimate operations. Mark began reviewing the other documents. With every page, he realized that his company had been entangled in a money laundering scheme. The sums were enormous, and the operations were meticulously planned. He couldn't believe it had all happened behind his back. Suddenly, his phone rang. The screen displayed Elliot's name, his business partner. "Hello, Elliot," Mark said, trying to remain calm. "Mark, you need to come to the office," Elliot said, his voice tense. "We've got a problem, and it's bigger than we thought." "What happened?" Mark asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The auditors found discrepancies. Some transactions, they look suspicious, and this could be tied to us." Mark felt a cold wave wash over him. He promised Elliot he would come immediately. Hanging up, he looked at the folder again. Everything was falling into place. Justin had continued using his company even now. When Mark arrived at the office, Elliot and a few other employees were already there. Their faces were serious, and the atmosphere was heavy. "We're dealing with something big," Elliot said, tossing a few folders in front of Mark. "These transactions look like part of a money laundering scheme. If it's true, we could be accused of complicity." Mark opened one of the folders and saw the same figures he'd found in Julia's documents. He realized there was no time to waste. Action was needed. "I know who's behind this," he said. His words drew surprised looks. "Who?" Elliot asked. "Justin," Mark replied. "He's the one who pulled us into this, and I have proof." He explained the folder he had received from Julia and showed them the documents. Elliot looked stunned. If this is true, we can use it to save the company. But it means we'll have to expose Justin. And that's going to be dangerous. Mark knew the risks but saw no other way. He decided to confront Justin and force him to stop his schemes. But first, he needed to ensure all the evidence was secure. That evening, he returned home and found Julia in their bedroom. She looked exhausted, but when she saw him, she stood up. "Did you find out?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "And now I need to know one more thing. Were you involved in this to the very end?" Julia shook her head. "No, Mark. I truly didn't know Justin was still using your company. But I understand that you don't trust me anymore." "That's true," he said coldly. "But we don't have time for this now. I'm meeting with Justin, and if he doesn't stop, I'll make sure he pays for everything." Julia took a step toward him. "Be careful," she said. "Justin doesn't play by the rules." Mark nodded and left the room. He knew this meeting could be the most dangerous one of his life. Mark stood in the darkness outside the old warehouse, waiting for Justin. The night was moonless, and only the faint light of a street lamp illuminated the entrance. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had the evidence, and he was ready to confront Justin. The warehouse door creaked open, and Justin stepped out. His posture was as confident as ever, and the smile on his face was more of a challenge than a greeting. "Mark," he said, spreading his arms, "you've finally decided to play openly with me, but you've made a grave mistake." "I'm here to put an end to your games," Mark replied, keeping his voice steady. "I have all the evidence. This time, you won't escape accountability." Justin's smile widened as he pulled a phone from his pocket. He pressed a few buttons, and the screen lit up. Justin extended the phone to Mark. "See for yourself," he said. Mark took the phone and saw a video. In it, Julia was talking to Justin. Her words were like a knife to the heart. "I can't take this anymore," she said in the video. "Mark doesn't understand anything. His company is just a front. You and I can accomplish more than he ever dreamed of." Mark felt his stomach drop. He looked up at Justin. "This is doctored," he said, though there was doubt in his voice. "Do you really think that?" Justin tilted his head. "Julia has been with me all along. She's only been pretending to be your ally. But now, she doesn't have a choice anymore." "You're lying," Mark shouted, but his confidence was waning with each passing second. "You know it's the truth," Justin continued. "She promised to help me with your company. All these years, she's been playing both sides. Did you really think she'd stay loyal?" Mark clenched his fists. His head swirled with thoughts. He recalled every moment Julia seemed suspicious, all those days she disappeared without explanation. But could he really trust Justin? Suddenly, the warehouse door opened again, and two men dressed in black entered. They walked over to Justin, and one of them placed a hand on his shoulder. "What is this?" Mark asked, stepping back. "This is your last warning," Justin said. "If you don't stop, I'll destroy everything you have. Your company, your life, your reputation. It'll all be mine." Mark felt cold sweat drip down his back. He knew Justin wasn't bluffing, but he also knew he couldn't back down anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," Mark said, "and I won't let you ruin what I've built." Justin stepped forward, his face mere inches from Mark's. "You've already lost," he whispered. "You just don't realize it yet." Suddenly, one of the men in black grabbed Mark's arm. He tried to break free, but the odds weren't in his favor. He was dragged toward the warehouse doors. "We'll see each other again, Mark," Justin said, his voice calm and assured. "And next time, you'll regret not stopping when you had the chance." Mark heard the door slam shut behind him, leaving him in darkness. Mark lay on the cold concrete floor, trying to gather his thoughts. His wrists throbbed from the rough grip of the men in black, and one thought kept circling in his mind. How had he let Justin outmaneuver him like this? In the warehouse's dim light, he could barely make out the contours of metal shelves. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of a door closing. He was alone. Mark scanned the room. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to focus. He felt the phone in his pants pocket, miraculously unnoticed by his captors. Slowly, he retrieved it and turned on the flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, revealing a small part of the space. On the wall, there was a grimy inscription, "Trust no one." Mark sighed. The words felt like a warning echoing in his mind. He tried to stand but suddenly noticed an envelope lying on the floor. It looked as if it had been left there specifically for him. Mark hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. Inside was a letter and several photographs. The letter read, "What you know is just the tip of the iceberg. Julia is the key. But you're not ready to learn the whole truth." The photographs froze the blood in his veins. They showed Julia, but not with Justin. She was with another man, their embraces far too intimate. On the back of each photo were dates. All of them matched the times she had claimed to be with friends or at work. Mark felt his anger rising, but he also realized this could be part of Justin's game. He couldn't let his emotions take over. At that moment, he heard footsteps outside the door. Someone was coming back. He quickly hid the envelope and turned off the flashlight. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure it could be heard. The door creaked open, and one of the men in black stepped inside. He scanned the room and left without noticing Mark hidden in the shadows. Mark decided to act. He moved toward the slightly ajar door and cautiously peeked outside. The hallway was empty. He moved quickly, trying to find an exit. His phone vibrated. A message from Julia. "Where are you? We need to talk." Mark paused. Her words stirred conflicting emotions in him. Did she know he'd met with Justin? Was this genuine concern? He decided to reply later. First, he needed to get out of this place. He found a door leading outside, but it was locked. Nearby was a small window letting in faint light. Mark realized it was his only chance. With difficulty, he climbed through it, cutting his hand on the sharp edge of the glass. When he emerged outside, he realized he was miles from the city. Checking his phone, he saw he had just enough signal to call a taxi. 30 minutes later, he was back home. Julia was waiting for him at the door. Her face looked worried, but Mark could no longer tell if it was genuine or just a mask. "Where were you?" she asked, rushing toward him. "You know better than I do," he replied coldly as he brushed past her. "Mark, listen to me," she exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Did you find anything out? What did he tell you?" "What do you think of this?" he said, pulling the photographs from the envelope and tossing them at her feet. Julia stared at the photos for a few seconds before raising her eyes to Mark. Her face was pale, drained of all color. This isn't true. It's fabricated," she whispered. "Stop lying, Julia." Mark shouted. "Who is this man? What else are you hiding?" She sank to the floor, covering her face with her hands. "I can't," she said. "I can't tell you everything." "Then I'll find the truth myself," Mark said, his voice cold as ice. He left the room, leaving Julia alone with her tears. Mark sat in his office, trying to sort through the chaos in his mind. The photos, the envelope, Julia. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't fully assemble. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, he finally answered. "Mark Clark?" said a voice with a slight accent. The man sounded confident but rushed. "Who is this?" Mark asked warily. "You're looking for answers," the voice said. "I know the truth about Julia. She's not who she seems. But if you want to know more, we need to meet." Mark frowned. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Because I have evidence of her innocence," the man said. "But you need to hurry. Justin knows I'm trying to contact you. Meet me in an hour at the gas station by the old highway. Come alone." The call ended, leaving Mark with a flood of new questions. Who was this man? Could he really prove Julia's innocence? Or was this another ploy by Justin? Despite his doubts, Mark decided to go. He needed to know the truth. The gas station by the old highway was dimly lit by a few flickering lamps. Mark arrived early to assess the area. Apart from one car, the lot was empty. Inside the car sat a man in a hood, smoking a cigarette. Mark parked nearby and got out, keeping a safe distance as he approached the stranger. "Are you the one who called?" Mark asked. The man stubbed out his cigarette and nodded. "I don't have much time," he said. "Justin's watching me. But I know your wife wasn't his accomplice. She was only trying to protect you. Why should I believe you?" Mark asked, his voice tense. The man pulled a small drive from his pocket and handed it to Mark. This contains a recording you need to see. It'll explain everything. Mark took the drive, but suddenly the sound of an engine echoed in the distance. A black car pulled into the lot, and its doors flew open. Two men stepped out, their presence intimidating. "We need to go," the stranger said, grabbing Mark's arm. "They're here for me." But it was too late. One of the men pulled out a weapon and aimed it at them. "Don't move," he ordered coldly. Mark felt his heart race. The stranger leaned close and whispered, "You need to protect this recording. It'll change everything." Suddenly, the stranger lunged forward, trying to distract the men. Mark seized the opportunity and sprinted to his car. As he started the engine, he heard the sounds of a struggle but didn't look back. Driving off, he left the stranger behind. On the drive home, Mark couldn't shake the events of the night. What had happened to the stranger? And what was on the drive? Once home, he immediately plugged it into his laptop. A video appeared on the screen. It was a recording of a conversation between Julia and Justin. Julia looked scared and desperate. "I've done everything you asked," she said, "but I can't do this anymore. Mark doesn't know anything, and I don't want him to get hurt." "You've forgotten who's in control," Justin replied, his voice cold. "If you go against me, both you and Mark will pay the price." Mark leaned back in his chair, anger boiling inside him. Julia really had been trying to protect him, but now the question remained, could he save them both? Mark sat on the couch, still processing what he had seen on the flash drive. Julia stood by the window, her back to him. Her posture was tense, as if bracing for a blow. The silence in the room was heavy, and only the dim light from the lamp cast shadows on the walls. "Do you have anything else to say?" Mark finally spoke, not taking his eyes off her. Julia turned around. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she held them back. She knew this was her last chance. "There's another video," she said, her voice trembling. "What you saw was only part of it. But there's another recording, one that could destroy Justin forever. And me too." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? What's on it?" he asked, his voice growing colder. Julia covered her face with her hands, then took a deep breath. "It's a recording from one of our meetings," she began. "I was in his apartment. He thought he had everything under control, but I knew he was recording us. I found the hidden camera but couldn't destroy it. That video is still in his safe." "In Justin's apartment?" Mark asked, feeling anger bubble inside him. "And you didn't think to tell me sooner?" "I was afraid," she replied, stepping closer to him. "I was afraid you'd hate me." Mark stood from the couch, walking past her. "Tell me what's on that video, Julia," he said through clenched teeth. She reached out to stop him, but he stepped away. "It's compromising," she said quietly. "It's not just me. There are other women. Women he coerced into doing what he wanted. He used those recordings to blackmail them. And now he could do the same to me." Mark was silent. He knew this video could be the key to everything. A weapon against Justin, but also a final blow to his trust in Julia. He turned to her, his gaze icy. "You want me to get this video?" he asked. "To risk everything to save you?" Julia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered, "but it's the only way to stop him. If the police get that video, he won't be able to hurt anyone else." Mark thought for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and started dialing. "What are you doing?" Julia asked, her voice tinged with panic. "Calling Elliot," he replied. "I need help. I'm not going in there alone." An hour later, Mark and Elliot stood outside Justin's apartment building. Their plan was simple: break in, find the safe, and retrieve the video. But even the best-laid plans could go wrong. Justin's apartment was in a high-end building in the city center, complete with security. Elliot, who had experience with such situations, quickly disabled the alarm, and they slipped into the elevator. Reaching the correct floor, they quietly entered the apartment. "The safe should be in his study," Mark whispered. They carefully navigated the dark apartment until they reached the study. Behind a painting, they found the safe. Elliot began working on the lock. Suddenly, they heard the sound of keys jingling at the door. Someone was coming home. "We won't make it," Elliot whispered. "We need to hide." They hid behind the study door, listening as Justin entered the apartment. His footsteps echoed as he moved closer. Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest. If they were discovered, everything would be lost. The darkness enveloping Justin's study felt suffocating. Mark and Elliot stood pressed against the wall, trying to remain unnoticed. Justin moved through the apartment, his footsteps loud in the silence. Then everything went still. Mark realized he was holding his breath. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a door opening. Mark glanced around, trying to understand what was happening. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Justin, we need to talk," Julia said, her tone firm but tinged with tension. Mark stiffened. What was she doing here? Her presence could only mean she knew more than she had let on. "Julia," Justin replied, his voice laced with amusement. "I didn't expect to see you here. Have you come to surrender?" "No," she answered coldly. "I've come to end this, once and for all." Mark clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. Her words sounded as though she was on Justin's side, but something in her voice suggested there was more to it. "And how do you plan to do that?" Justin laughed. "You've forgotten who's in control here." "I know about the safe," she said. Her words made Mark and Elliot tense up. "I know there's a video in there that you use to keep everyone in fear, but I also know there's more." Justin fell silent. His steps slowed as he moved closer to Julia. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said. "You know how this could end." Julia took a step back, but her voice remained firm. "I have nothing left to lose," she replied. "But you, Justin, you're afraid? Because in that safe, there's not just dirt on others. There's something that could destroy you, too." Mark felt his patience reaching its limit. Elliot motioned for him to wait. They had to act carefully. "I don't know what you're talking about," Justin said calmly, though tension was evident in his tone. "You've always thought you were smarter than everyone," Julia said, her eyes blazing with determination. "But this time, you've miscalculated." At that moment, Elliot managed to open the safe. He pulled out a flash drive, papers, and a few photographs. Mark immediately realized they had found what they were looking for. But their victory was short-lived. "What are you doing?" Justin shouted as he spotted them in the study. Mark and Elliot stepped out of the shadows. Elliot held the flash drive in his hand. "We're done playing by your rules," Mark said, his voice icy. Justin laughed. "You think that's everything? You have no idea how deep you're in. If you don't hand that over now, you'll lose everything." Julia looked at Mark. Her eyes pleaded for his trust. "Mark, this is your chance to stop him," she said. "But you have to trust me." He hesitated for only a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and started recording. "Justin, if you think I'm going to let you walk away from this, you're mistaken. This time, it's going to be different." Justin took a step forward, but Julia stopped him. "If you come any closer, I'll give all of this to the police," she said. "And then nothing will save you." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police were already on their way. Justin realized he had lost. "You'll regret this," he said before attempting to flee through the back exit. The police stormed into the apartment, apprehending him within seconds. Mark, Julia, and Elliot remained standing amidst the chaos. "Is this the end?" Elliot asked, holding up the flash drive. Mark looked at Julia. He saw a mixture of relief and pain in her eyes. "I hope so," he said, but his voice carried more doubt than certainty. "Do you think Julia truly deserved Mark's forgiveness? And was it worth risking everything for that video?"